Our next presenter, Caroline Lee, works for the Lawrenceville School, where she teaches English. She just finished up her creative capstone titled Writing My Father's Story. She has performed her work for the First Person Arts Festival in Philadelphia and read for events sponsored by the Asian American Writers Workshop. Most recently, she was a writer-in-residence for the National Archives of Philadelphia. She currently lives in Lambertville, New Jersey, with her husband, son, and 2 dogs. This summer, she'll be attending VONA and the Breadloaf Writers Conference. Carolyn will now introduce us to her father as she reads from her capstone, Telling My Father's Story, Writing Through the Silences.
It's actually really helpful to go after Thomas because I feel like he set up the context. Just in terms of laying out a testament of how powerful a creative writing class can be. As a teacher, we're teaching the close reading and the analytical lenses, but to sort of flip the lens and become the writer, I think is a really transformative place to be, especially as adults. I was talking to the people in line during our graduation saying it's taken me, I think, close to 9 years to finish the MLA. I did one a summer and sort of worked through it. And I really, there are times like, oh, when's this thing going to be over? And now that I look back on it, I realize like what a blessing it was to be able to have a long stretch of time to do schooling and really grow with the process and be an adult and be able to reflect and process, the changes that you go through as you get older and life gets harder. So getting to work with Kitsy was so transformative, and I began the program thinking I was going to do something more scholarship-wise in terms of English and emerging art history. And I took a chance and took a creative writing course with her. And everything changed after that. And my desire to find my voice was really important at that time. And so just in those classes, the whole model of learning changed for me. And I bring it into my own classroom now where we learn how to value each and every voice, each and every person in class. There's a lot of collaboration. And there's this idea that, like for much of the day, especially as a teacher, I feel like I have to present this self of like I have it all together, I know the answers. Whereas when you're writing, the mindset is completely different. We are works in progress. The ego gets left at the door, and we have to dance and meditate and do crazy things that you probably would not feel comfortable doing. But because it's a culture of we're flawed and vulnerable, and we're just going to listen to one another, everything changes. So, so a plug for creative writing and just the power of language and the power of storytelling. So for the capstone, my project, for years I've been trying to write my father's story, but it's been hard. It's bits and pieces, and every time I kept taking a writing class, my mother's story kept coming out, which is fine, but I kept wanting to write about my father, and sort of worked through each class and grappled with that. And then this opportunity came up to work with the National Archives of Philly. They had boxes and boxes of documents from the Chinese Exclusion Acts, and they weren't quite sure how to make sense of them or what to do with them. They were only filed and organized, but nothing more beyond that. So they put out a call for a writer to see if there's somebody who could go through the files and take as many files as they could and create stories around those files, whether to piece together the newspaper articles and the documentation and the certificates, but try to figure out what exactly is stored here. So I did that for about a year and a half and tried to write these pieces, and the first pieces I wrote they hated because they said they were too dense, it's not useful to the public. The point of the performance, the point of the reading is to get the public to connect. And so then there's, it broached all these issues of, I'm so concerned about finding my voice for writing, but so much of writing is that interconnectiveness and the merging of a community's stories. So that focus shifted a bit. So I went through a lot of files, a lot of driving back and forth from New Jersey to Philly to try to create 3 stories, which were performed in September at the National Philadelphia History Museum. And a lot of that workshopping came through Kitsy's class, where I was able to just bring in these really awful drafts and say, help, I need feedback, and was given the opportunity to have a class full of really caring and compassionate readers give me useful feedback. So as that was happening, life was also happening, the story of my life, and it always goes back to my mom. Her house flooded, and so it was a terrible flood that we ended up having to purge her house. And as we went through her attic, we found a box full of my father's stories and memoirs that he had been trying to write. And a lot of the documents that I found looked like some of the documents that we're finding at the Philadelphia archives. So in retrospect, I realized that if I had found those files earlier, I don't think I would know how to make sense of it. But because I had this context kind of already in my head, I was able to make sense of my father's story. So eventually, as the deadline for the capstone drew near, I was able to write my father's story and continue to write it based on the research I'm doing here, but also just based on having a better understanding of context and the idea of revision, like we're constantly revising ourselves and our stories and looking at it from different perspectives. So the piece that I'm going to read is just the opening piece that I did for the performance for the archive. So it doesn't actually go into the files or the stories that I got to put together for these really amazing immigrants, but it's just the opening piece to pull in the voices. And the way that it was performed was I pulled 4 of my students, because I didn't really want to read it all myself, and I asked 4 of my students to read different parts. So today you'll only hear me reading it, but when it's actually performed, you hear a polyphony of different voices coming out, and so it kind of humanizes a lot of the documentation. So this is just the artist statement that we presented, and then I'll go into the actual piece. When I first began the Chinese Storytelling Project, I found myself overwhelmed with all the archival material. The archivists wheeled in carts of boxes that dated back to the late 1800s. These files were filled with documents, certificates, letters, rosters, health records, photographs, newspaper clippings. While I loved perusing through and holding these historical documents, I struggled to pull together the narrative strands. Sometimes the chronology was questionable, sometimes the names were mistaken, other times the testimonies did not align. I began to search for patterns in the language in order to centralize a frame narrative. I read over the countless testimonies and interviews, hoping to find a shared experience within the Chinese American community. The patterns I found reflected ambiguity. I found common statements to be, "I do not know," and "I do not remember." And thus the nature of the linguistic patterns grounded me in stories of silence, shame, memory, and trauma. The very notion of truth had become problematic. My writing mentor, Kitsi Watterson, suggested that I just let the archival material speak, ground the stories in the files, and rather than forcing a story, I had to give due respect to the files by simply listening and letting them speak. I had to examine the story of silence, as well as the subtle and sometimes subversive stories being spoken through the interviews, the letters, and the law. And when I was able to let the files speak and reveal, I found that there were multiple perspectives and multiple discourses at play, and all of these discourses were getting written onto the Chinese American body. In these moments of not knowing and not remembering were incredibly powerful stories. The truth of these stories, I believe, exists in the subtext, in the silence of the fiction. In many ways, the stories found their power in their ability to be revised and rewritten through these historical documents. My project then became about using the files to humanize and give voice to and for the Chinese American community. Okay, and so let's see if I can do this. So this is part of the opening reading. The subjunctive. Designating or relating to a verbal mood that refers to an action or state as conceived, rather than as a fact, and is therefore used chiefly to express a wish, command, an exhortation, or contingent, hypothetical, or prospective event. When we became a hypothetical threat, we became questionable. We had hunched over and squatted down and laid down the tracks. We hammered and hammered and hammered. We hammered down the railings of the railroad. We bore through the mountains, laying close to 10 miles of track in one day. We labored to construct the first transcontinental railroad, 1,907 miles of track. We labored alongside the Irish and the Germans. We were like conjunctions linking line to line to line. And when we finally laid the last of the tracks from one side of the country to the other, we spiked down the last post as if to end a run-on sentence of a very long paragraph of a lengthy story about the Chinese American railroad workers. A solid, emphatic period to conclude our story. One long declarative sentence, indicative mood of, "We have arrived," but our tan faces rarely made it into the photographs. We weren't invited to the final ceremony. We were almost heroic. We were almost pictured smiling and leaning victoriously on the last stake. You know the pose, foot posted on the lug of the shovel, hat tilted slightly forward, cigar in hand. We were almost immortalized like John Henry. Our hearts beat strong like his, but no one heard the cadence of our labored breathing. Our narrative was almost about how we helped to build the railroad with our hard work and dreams, with our sweat and calloused hands. Some stories speculate that we flew like birds into the mountains. Maybe that's why they called us celestials. We went airborne, swinging from baskets. We suspended ourselves over the mountain mouths to drop the dynamite. We lit the sticks, our parched bodies extensions of the wicks. We watched the fire drop into the black hole. Sometimes our desperate sweat chased after it as if to quench its flame. And then we felt a hard yank as we flew out of the air just in time to escape the explosions. Well, some of us did. Our story was pretty miraculous. And then, with a quick revision, our story became erased as quickly as the ground we raised. We became a question. The politicians asked, but what of the question of the Chinese? Our landmarks no longer mattered. We could no longer stake our claims in America, not literally nor figuratively. We became an issue that the newspapers declared as a threat to the survival of white manhood. They asked, shall we have the Chinese? No! Exclamation point. And what would follow were decades of suspicions, interrogations, and doubt. 1882 to 1943. We were people that existed in the subjunctive. We were paradoxes, real imaginaries, living widows, people not quite grounded in reality. We lived neither here nor there. Our bodies became texts of fantastical fictions. We were mythologized, we were demonized, and finally we were dehumanized. And like the subjunctive, we were contrary to the fact and conditional. The verbs in our narratives changed from active to passive. And in 1882, we became an act, and an imperative was exhorted. The Chinese must go, the Chinese must go, the Chinese must go. We had become subjugated. The question of the Chinese was answered with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Notice the passive voice. We answered with the retort, well, who wrote the act? Who set up the execution of this act? The act responded rather dryly. President Chesterfield Arthur and the Session 1 of the 47th Congress on behalf of the people of the United States of America. We asked, how was it that the government can enact decades of legalized racism for an entire ethnic population? How is it that one act could determine the good from the evil, the moral from the immoral? The act responded, the word weapons, storytelling, grand narratives. See here the document. The preamble. Whereas, in the opinion of the government of the United States, the coming of Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good order of certain localities within the territory thereof. Therefore, be it enacted that the coming of Chinese laborers to the United States be suspended. And thus, therefore, we are held in suspension by the words of the law. The act bound our bodies and contorted us into caricatures, exaggerated features of buck teeth, our thick queues of long braided hair transformed into wild serpents, our silken robes anachronistic, uncivilized, our eyes nefarious lacerations. We were not the melodious voices of Whitman's America. We were not the beautiful, muscular bodies of the frontier. We were the scarred and the diseased, the dirty, the fallen, the threat to the good order, the foreign. We were the voiceless and the unwanted.